I'm going to talk about a little bit about architecture. And to just preface that, I was a visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture in UCL, and I continue to be for about 4 years. And you hang out there and you talk to people. And I was interested in interactivity. And so I started talking with the architects about what they thought about interactivity. Now, many of them make installations and so on. But those aren't necessarily wildly different from other kinds of interaction. But when I was talking to Alan Penn, who's the head of the 5 schools, he said, well, architecture is all about social interaction. It's all about social interaction. And then I said, well, what do you think an interface is? And he said, well, if you open the door, it's a different interface. I'm thinking, open the door, it's a different interface in our... And then, of course, I thought about that for about 30 days. And then I began to understand it. And it was in light of thinking about that question, what is an interface for architecture, that I then inquired more deeply into the nature of interactivity in general and interfaces in general. And what I'm going to present today is a first effort at talking about some of these things in a talk, although I did write a very long paper that is much too long on the general topic of architecture and HCI. So there are countless forms of interaction and countless forms of interfaces. But when you're interested in designing those, you're typically have some special thoughts in mind, like controlling something. Now, architecture and HCI often differ in that architecture is about how people dwell in things, and HCI is often a lot about control or nuance or something about your relation to the artifacts. But nonetheless, there are interactions in both forms. And the question is, can we begin to classify them in a way that is revealing and exposing principles? So in the control sense, you typically want to know where the input devices are. But not in all kinds of interactivity do you know where the input devices are. And we'll talk about that. And you typically like to know whether you are or you're not interacting. But again, you don't always. And that can be a difference between implicit and explicit interactivity. But there are other things going on as well. So in looking at this, I thought there were 3 fundamental kinds of interaction that are significantly different. Significantly different. And the one is, broadly speaking, the classical one, which is inspired by physical manipulation, called direct manipulation. Then if you look at contextual aware stuff, there's a network interaction, and that's a different kind of model. And then the last one is what I'm calling the socio-ecological or embodied kind of interaction, and that's an architectural one. And it's got quite a different spirit to it. And both the last 2 and 3, have been understudied, 3 being not studied at all. So here's simple physical interaction. Here's simple sensor interaction. Here's what you have learned historically was interaction with a classical thing. Here's one where people can operate on the same screen, but it's just a tweak. Here's another one. It's a little more complicated because they could be talking to themselves and so on, and then speaking over it and all sorts of things, although they doubt they do speak. And now we have this sort of thing where we have on-body stuff as well as naturally the ones you're actually explicitly controlling. And now let's contrast those ones, which I take are pretty familiar to everybody, with this. What's the interface here? This is a rather attractive thing at the 2018 Biennale. Now, what is the interaction? What sort of interaction is going on here? You can stick your head inside that canopy. You can stick your head inside that canopy. You can stick your head inside there. I believe there's some mirrors somewhere. But what is the sort of interaction going on there? It certainly is one we do all the time. What's the interaction going on here? It's not just physical, right? It's highly social. And there's so many things happening here. It does go on. What sort of interaction is happening here? So early architecture. interface. And now we have another kind of interaction, this social interaction. And why would it be hard to imagine a robot in the place of one of these people? What's missing from the robot that makes it hard to appreciate the robot inside this social bubble? And when you look at it, this is essentially the main point that I will be working toward by inching my way up to it, by going through the other things. First, they have shared experience, they're shared emotions, they are the shared valuation if they're in sync. They have a shared sensory motor engagement of the space because they're cooperating, coordinating themselves like that. And so for me, this is, again, this social niche notion of interaction. I don't have a good name that is going to be catchy enough. But it seems to me that that's the next phase of HCI. And it's going to be involved in sharing spaces. And once we think that way, we have to start thinking differently about the nature of what the interface and interaction is supposed to be about. That means that people are engaged in joint activity, and the space has to facilitate and coordinate with the joint activity. They are sharing epistemic spaces. They know what's going on with each other. They have a good idea what the other person knows, and they know that they know it. So there's a lot of recursion about that for grounding things and common ground. There's shared valuation, shared emotions, and there are these shared peripersonal spaces. So when you're an architect, one of the things you're trying to design for is to facilitate. And you facilitate things that are core human values, like delight in play and interaction, or in social interaction, which is usually, values. You're trying to facilitate the experience and the execution of these values in your life. You're trying to improve performance, of course, in many ways. But joint activity is a key one because it's about social things. And then also to facilitate the complexity of social interaction, which, for instance, having rhythmic structure enables people, when you consider how could they get that pounding stick into that tiny space unless they were coordinated rhythmically. How much more efficient they can be if they coordinate rhythmically. So you can get more complex actions if you integrate like that. Okay, so this whole social, ecological, embodied thing, this type of interaction is different in a few fundamental ways from the other notions of both interactivity and interface, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So here's the agenda. There are 3 genus of interactivity. I say genus because each one, of course, has countless examples which can be finely differentiated, but don't gain you much by doing that. There are logical properties to these interactions, and that's something that when thinking about it, I thought for me, an advance was when I started to think, well, interactivity, A, B, interacts, A, B, you can treat it as a relation. Well, any relation can be defined with respect to symmetry, transitivity, and reflexivity. So by doing that, I suddenly got some leverage by using that as a forcing function to throw out some ideas. And I'll go through that quickly. And then talk about some differences in interfaces, and then what's special about the social niche, and so on. So here's 3 types. The classic, network, and the one to be talked about. So the architectural one, I'll deal with the others in a second, but the architectural one is the one that isn't really explicitly discussed. I talked to many, many people at the Bartlett. They have something like 700 faculty. It's the largest architecture school in the world. And aside from the people doing work on interactive installations who are quite concerned with interactivity, they nonetheless, it's just, they're practitioners. And they're theorists, but that doesn't seem to be a topic of concern. So it's implicit in the discourse. You pick up some ideas, but And one thing was clear was what Alan Penn was emphasizing was the priority of social interaction and the experience people have. That's what they're trying to create. So we have experience and we see the importance of social elements in some kind of design like this and the importance of experience in a design like this. So the last one we could fill out by having this architectural interactivity, saying, well, look, a person has situation awareness. So when you think about classical interaction, you don't concern yourself with the situation awareness of a person. The person in classical case is going to be manipulating an input device. The system doesn't have to know the situation awareness of a person. It doesn't really have to worry about their peripersonal awareness, what's happening exactly around them. They're in charge of that. The person's in charge. Yeah?
What's context aware versus situation aware?
So context aware is I was just doing context aware design. And I will go over what makes network interactivity. But in the case of, well, I'll do it in a second, OK?
Oh, wait.
I'm just characterizing these things, which are, these are important concepts for this other notion. One way to look at these also is to start asking about what is the direction of adaptation. So in the classic one, the people adapt to the shape of the item. People adapt to the computer. The computer doesn't particularly adapt to them in the classical one. Then in the network one, which is context aware, the humans, the AI in the system, I'm going to assume there's going to be AI in all these systems now, they're adapting to us at least as much and often much more than we're adapting to them. But the key thing about the embodied interaction is always this co. Everything is collaboration, co-adaptation, coordination, cooperation. Everything is co. So here's the logical type. So we say, well, let's characterize them. Let's look at them in terms of symmetry, transitivity, and reflexivity. So looking at symmetry. If A interacts with B, then B interacts with A. That's the concept that we're exploring now in the different models. So interaction is a type of symmetric causation, and I think what differentiates interaction from action is symmetry. So we know it in the Newtonian case, where A acts on B and B acts back on A, or rubber hits the road, the tire thing, but the interface where the rubber hits the road, you measure the quality of the interface by its capacity to allow the traction to reflect the force as perfectly as possible from the car into the car. So that's great. So I do it, it does something back. Maybe it's feedback, but whatever it is I cause a state change in it, it causes a state change in me. That's the heart of interaction. And it's different than just action. In the case of action, here, if I am pointing and touching the book, I'm interacting with the book. But if I'm not, if I'm just, allow the book to just be resting on the table and I'm just reading it, some people will say, well, reading's a very interactive process. And you say, well, really interactive or active? So I will argue that it is just active, not just, but active. Because I don't modify the state of the book. My reading the book does not modify the state of the book as much as it might modify me in so many different ways. It's physically unchanged before and after. So, and the dictionary definition of interaction is reciprocal. So, act of reading the wall doesn't change the wall as much as it might be an active process in me. For instance, if I ask you to look at this, this is a very big process of active vision on your part, right? You're trying to see what the two are, and you're doing the various sorts of things. Here's a little help. And now you can see that you have to really parse them quite differently. OK, active vision. Is it interactive? You're moving your eyes, you're saccading, you're doing all of those things, but it's not interactive. So conclusion one is, all models of interactivity have to support symmetry. That is the hallmark. And that's why interaction is not just action, because it's symmetric. 2, transitivity. Yes?
You said all models of interaction should support symmetry.
Has to support, yeah, all have to be, incorporate symmetry as a relate, yeah.
Does it have to be equal, like
We can talk about that.
equal and opposite?
Not necessarily. You know, some person could, yes. But there has to be state change on both sides. Could be one shot, could be continuous. I mean, it could be, repetitive. There's so many types of interaction, but within the big genuses, they still will all support symmetry. So here we have now transitivity. A acts on B, B acts on C. If it's a transitive, then A acts on C. Right? Now, causation is not typically transitive. But it can be, and that becomes the question. When would it be transitive? So here, if something is transitive, I can immediately operate on something else. I'm not immediately acting on it, I'm mediating. I'm acting on it through a mediator. So my hand controls in a good way the screwdriver controls in a good way the screw controls in a good way the penetration into the wood, and does the person interact with the wood? That would be mediate. If you think that the person interacts with the wood, that's mediated. And we could say that if there is such a thing as mediating, then we can have chaining, just as there was. So here we have the hand. It's a physical cause. Go down the one side. The physical cause changes something in the screwdriver. The screwdriver gives me force feedback. So there is no question I can interact with the screwdriver. With my hand, I can interact with the screwdriver. The screwdriver interacts with the screw. There's physical control of the screwdriver onto the screw. The screw gives force feedback to the screwdriver, which passes on, propagates that force feedback back to me. So in a certain sense, I'm now getting haptic feedback, which I could distinguish. Suppose the connection between the screwdriver and the screw is not perfect. I could distinguish the imperfection in the connection between the screwdriver and the screw from the force coming back from the screw, which is propagated again from the wood, back up. So I can distinguish these different elements all the way down to, say, the wood, the screwdriver, and up to my hand. So this would be a nice case where we're preserving the kind of transitivity we want of interaction. When you look at it, that only applies when there's the appropriate structural coupling. So the screwdriver has been designed, and the screw, to work to create a structural coupling, a reliable structural coupling with the screw. And the screw itself is designed to penetrate the wood and to not wobble around once you get it started. When you have the hand on that ball-peen hammer, the hand is controlling the hammer, one hand. The other hand is controlling the center punch, and the center punch is also controlling it onto the material, so that we have a coordination between the two hands striking each other. So we have got this strong structural coupling, which means that we haven't, imagine we had those two balls again, the balls connecting, and we didn't have them on that support. Then one ball could go off in any different direction. We wouldn't have transitivity going all the way to the end ball. It's because they were so highly constrained that they were canalized in the way they were operating with reduced degrees of freedom that we could have the impetus from the one come all the way back, pass through, the impetus pass to the end. So you've got to have that structural coupling. And an appropriate coupling enables an alignment between your intention to control something and the execution. So, of course, in the case of a mouse, we have a digital physical interaction and a digital physical interface. You've got to cross it. The mouse enables you to cross it. And because it's appropriately structurally coupled between the mouse and what happens inside the computer and on the screen, on display. So just to say a little bit more about this mediated interaction, it's a kind of seeing through process. So the racket is the mediating instrument through which a player interacts with the ball. But they don't interact with the ball directly, obviously. And when they're playing and they have mastery of the structural coupling to the ball, then everything is fluent and the racket is transparent. And they therefore just think about the ball and not the racket if they're really good, and they can enforce that structural coupling. Of course, that is the challenge. They only think about where to place the ball and spin. And so the causation and control go through the racket to the ball. The classical white cane. People don't perceive the cane. They see through the cane to what they're touching. That's the original phenomenological notion of transparency, is seeing through, like glasses. I don't perceive my glasses. I perceive through my glasses, although I guess I could perceive my glasses, but that's going to be a completely different effect. So we need an adequate neuroscientific account of the nature of this seeing through, but people are sort of working on that through absorption of tools and so on. Or when you have a laser pointer, you see through the laser pointer right to the thing you're interested in. So the domain you're interested in is the remote domain, and you're just seeing through, like the tennis racket, with the pointer. And when you make controls, it's with respect to the remote domain, even though, of course, the peripersonal control is very fine here, the actual sense of control is this magnification at the other end. There are problems with transitivity, though. Because of the structural alignment requirement, it's hard to explain exactly what structural alignment is or structural coupling is. So who's interacting with whom in groups? They're all close. A could be interacting with B, B could be interacting with C, but is A interacting with C? When do people walk with each other? When they're in a long march, are they walking, is the front one walking with the back one? How far does that go? Can we get a definition of this? Is this a vague notion, this alignment notion? When you're playing tug of war, how many people can be on it and still be said to be in some kind of joint activity? I mean, you are in a joint activity, but what exactly can you say about the transitivity of interaction? So you say, well, what about a system? Let's call the structural coupling a system. So now you say, okay. Do you think you're interacting with the gears when you're setting the time? I mean, no one ever does it anymore. But if you were setting the time, would you be interacting with the gears? Well, how about the car? When you turn the steering wheel, you know there has to be transitivity of cause in order to get the wheels turned. And you know there has to be a structural alignment in order for the steering wheel to reliably inform the position of the car, or the wheels. So, but do we get feedback the way we did with the screwdriver in order to establish that we can register the presence of the intermediate parts? Well, if these were brakes and they made kind of squeaky noises, very subtle squeaky noises, you might find that the person was responsive or adapting to the brake sounds, whether they heard it or not, or some kind of squeaky things, or something feel in the steering wheel that actually goes down to, in this case, the piston or the some part in there. Looks like a piston. But it could be actually a gear, a differential down inside there, a gear. So if the person can get an epistemic foothold, even if they're not aware of it, then in my case, there is a structural alignment with the appropriate epistemic connections to have it come back, to have the force feedback from that particular part, as opposed to a fusion. Anyway, these are challenges. So we could also say explicit interactivity is when you know you're interacting with a given part. And implicit is you don't know you're interacting, but you do satisfy whatever the requirements are that we say they are for interaction, symmetry, and perhaps transitivity. Just as I said, if you don't know you're responding to the noises, but you are, then we could say you're implicitly interacting with the gearbox. steering gearbox, even though you don't know that you are. So models of interactivity support transitivity, but only when there's a theory of either semantic transparency, seeing through, which will explain it to us, like the cane, or the binoculars, or the remote laser pointer, and a theory of structural coupling, which is controlling through. So that means we have to articulate these things if we want an adequate theory. Reflexivity. Okay, now we start to march into territory people never go. And that was actually the big benefit of starting thinking this way, was to come up to reflexivity. So I can't walk on myself, but I certainly can hit myself or scratch myself or amuse myself, or I can do lots of things. Talk with myself. I can do lots of things with myself. So A can interact with A. Now here's unmediated action on oneself. This is mediated. It might seem like you're acting with yourself, but in fact, the mirror image B is structurally coupled to A through the camera and through whatever it is that's generating that image. So I'm interacting with the image in a structure no different than using your mouse. It just happens to be that when I do this, the display response is so familiar and related, but that's irrelevant. So in this case, it's just ordinary transitive or just ordinary interactivity. Each person is controlling their own action, and so they are interacting with themselves in the sense I grant you that this is a challenging thing to make, because by that token, every time I do this, I'm sort of interacting with myself, except, you know, so there's a delicacy here, but I didn't do that.
Was that reflexive?
No, it wasn't, and it wasn't wanted. So the thing about the dancing is each person interacts with the other person. That's ordinary interaction. It is dense and highly coupled, and it's fluid, and it has a lot of specialness to it. But each person is also part of the system of the together dancing. So they are themselves part of the system. So when they make a change to the system, it's a reflexive thing on the system. System's acting on itself in some sense. And so you can have a reflexiveness in this that you couldn't have before. So this is a little bit like the scratching, when scratching themselves, when you consider the person now to be two. So I'm scratching ourselves. We are scratching ourselves. Now, you can not agree with it, or you can agree with it, but it seems to me that there is an interesting tension in this area here, which would serve to differentiate the nature of the possibilities of social interaction from the other kinds of interaction. So I would say that most models of interactivity don't support reflexivity, but human-to-human interaction is often reflexive. So that in conversation, people can make reflexive moves that change the conversation, and we don't say it's just between them, it's a kind of holistic change that's happening. You can disagree because you say that your conception of part-whole relation doesn't allow that, or you can say, no, the whole is interacting through the parts, but with itself. So if I could make this adequately compelling, there is then a difference in these forms like that only the architectural or the social version has the reflexivity. So here's the summary so far. By asking about the logical nature of different kinds of interactivities, or the sort of genus of interactions, we discover that there are deep differences. I haven't really done much for your network notion yet. So for instance, We can distinguish interaction from action because interaction requires symmetry. Some forms of interaction are transitive. We can talk about how far they go because we are looking at notions of structural alignment or some kind of coupling conditions. So that means we motivate an analysis of when those conditions are satisfied. And the special case of reflexive is interesting in the world of architecture and the social world. So let's look at some differences in the interfaces now. So here's classical one. So in the classical one, we have a digital physical boundary that must be crossed. In the case of social interaction, we don't have a digital physical boundary that must be crossed. We don't have, the people are part of the very interface. But in the classic cases of HCI that we design, because it's on the digital world, you have to cross the digital world. So there has to be explicit input devices, whether you know about them or not. So there is a boundary. So the classic and easiest way of talking about an interface is to think of it as some kind of n-dimensional boundary where we might as well think of the different ways of manipulating things to be an n-dimensional or n-channel boundary, and that we have a human side and we have the other side. And then there's that interface with the inputs getting to that and the outputs coming back. And in the classical account, where we have to cross the physical-digital divide, and the goal of classical HCI is to facilitate control of something, whether it was a power station, a jet, or it turns out to be an application like Photoshop. The goal is to facilitate your control of the things over there. So when we do away with the physical plant, we just are controlling the digital plant, which is the Photoshop application. And now we want to be able to know where the input devices are. And we want to know where the output is. And the good design, transparent design, is to allow you to understand these things very clearly. So we want to feel in control, and when, control is explicit, intentional, and transparent. When we do have that feeling of being in control, the input is intentional because we know where the input devices are and we know what we can do to the input devices. And if it's good and well designed, when I do something here, I can see the effect of what I've done. So that's semantic transparency. And so I have the feeling of direct control. The system typically is closed in that there are outside factors that we just don't consider as part of the system. Something random happens, it's considered a bug, wasn't supposed to happen, and that only the actions on the input side are actions directed at the system. If something else happens that changes the system, it's not meant to be an input. So it's meant to be closed to outside. In that sense, it's meant to be determinate. And interactions with the interface do not change the interface. I can move the mouse any way I want. I can stand in front of the camera any way I want. I do not change the camera. I do not change the mouse by using them. That's their job. So we have to sort of adapt to the interface. Network interfaces. So here we have all sorts of things that are connected. And we'll suppose that sensors, like say this room has got a few sensors, I suppose those are microphones. So there are input devices, there are cameras. I don't really know where all the cameras are. I don't know where all the input devices are, and I certainly don't know where all the output devices are. So I don't know if there's any voice control or gesture control. I believe that if I get up, I am controlling the camera now, but I'm not sure. I had to ask. That's this kind of world. We have the on-body sensors that could be tracking us in ways that we don't know. We may not even know that they're on us. And then we have all these outputs that we don't necessarily know about. And this is our life from now on, right? We all accept this is our life from now on. And now, who's in control here? I'm not in explicit control, that's for sure. because I don't even know what I'm doing with respect to the system. So it's quite different. And if there's another person involved, why there's so much indeterminacy. I don't know who's doing what, when, and what the effects are. I don't know how they do load balancing. If there are a lot of people on the network, I have no idea how they're going to solve that, because the system itself is going to have to determine how to load balance and who gets what when and how they're going to time slice it. Imagine an operating system. Who knows what it's doing? So this is a rather different kind of world, this interactivity here. Transitivity here, hard to say how exactly it plays out. So I'm often unaware of the input possibilities. I act on things without knowing it, like the cameras, plural. There could be sound coming out that I don't know about it, so I don't often know about the output possibilities. There could be heat controls, there could be light controls. In smart buildings, more and more, all these things are happening. I never know all the effects of my action. And so I have very limited intentionality, a limited sense of control, and a limited explicit understanding. I might implicitly interact with a lot of things because, in fact, I do pick up regularities that I don't know about as an implicit knowledge of statistical regularities. And so I respond differentially because of picking up the implicit things, just as the car. But I would be implicitly interacting.
Difference between this and the prior one in the sense of like there's not one main agent. Like if you had a person controlling a swarm of drones where all the drones were interacting with each other, but they were the ones who sort of, you know, had these gloves that let them control everything explicitly. So would that be an example of network?
That would be network as well, where you have a lot of sort of quasi-agents in there. And whatever I start here ramifies out there in ways that I can't predict. And then what they do in return, I have no idea. So that's one example. The networks are very broad. I would expect it to be a much more common form of study that we need to do, the interactivity of this whole very much bigger genus than classical HCI. So many kinds are going to be. Again, the interactions with the interface do not usually change the interface. So if I wander around, yes, the camera's moving, but that's the camera's job. I'm not changing the camera. So there could be learning and adaptation that would cause a change, like bringing more cameras online or something. But we'd have to talk about whether they were there waiting and so on, whether that counted as a change. So the goals, essentially, of classical and network interaction are, in the classical one, I control the device to whatever degree I can, and it's supposed to help me do that. It increases my power because I can do things I couldn't do now. The network one is gathering information for the network owners, and they're partly controlling me, though I partly control it. So we've got some differences in the general orientation. Now compare that to architectural interfaces. So in architectural interfaces, we have something like this. So this space is intentionally designed to support different forms of social interaction and work. It's a Microsoft space, possibly in London. Now come back to the question that I asked Alan about, the architect in, so he says, you close the door, you open the door, they're different. You say, how could that be a different interface? Well, if you think of the social interface to be the constraints acting on the people's social interactions, I've changed the privacy levels of the room when the door is open. Somebody walks by the door, I see them. So the social affordances are different. So I have changed this sort of social bubble. So I was thinking about the serving hatch, which was a popular thing in the 50s, passeporte in French. And so look at these two different serving hatches. The serving hatch, it restricts the kind of social relations you can have with the person on the inside. You won't have a deep philosophical conversation between when you're on the outside talking to the person, and not just because they're doing the cooking on the inside. Leave aside all the social and sort of normative implications of having a person on the inside doing that sort of thing. And you contrast that with a cooking surface like this, where the cook can participate socially in a free way, these are very different social interfaces. One is designed to enable the full participation. The other is designed to restrict full social participation. So an architect can have a big impact on the nature of the social participation, the social activities going on in the space by the way they deploy surfaces and functionalities and so on. So here, I think this is a simple idea of a social interface and how it can reshape the social possibilities of the space. We have, when you design a space like this, obviously people are thinking very much about the different kinds of social coves, alcoves, and the spaces that people could come together in. Who can see whom? Who can sit where? All these are these line of sight considerations, or the size of the tables, the layout of the tables, the benches, the bar. All of this is part designed for, of course, the nature of the social interactivity. A successful bar might deform the shape of the bar, a successful venue, in a way that leads for more social interaction of an intimate sort. Maybe they would become famous like that because it turns out people have better social experiences. So the space of interaction and social possibility is physically constrained, but it's a soft constraint, very soft constraint. So here is the main point about this again. Adding a wall can change the socio-spatial interface. Opening a hole can change the socio. Opening the door can, but so can removing a table or a chair. It changes it changes some social affordances, and so would adding a mobile phone or a group printer or a water cooler. They're going to change the social affordances. We are not accustomed to thinking about interfaces as these three-dimensional shapes with things in them, three-dimensional spaces with things in them. But of course they are, and they're interfaces for social interaction and other kinds of interaction. So you take a room and you say, well, how many interfaces are in here? There are so many possible interfaces in here. Where would people have a conversation? Depends whether you're cleaning, what kind of interface you have. Depends how you're playing. Or if you're sharing a closet, that's a big social interface. And these interfaces come into being when people are there to animate the space. So the people are an essential part of this social niche. That's how I like to think of them, as a kind of niche. In the case of niches, ecological, some say niche, but it's so ugly. Ecological niches, they dynamically change. I once tried to understand what a niche is, and it turns out it is anything but simple. So when more creatures come into the same planes, for instance, the niche deforms that one creature is living in as the others apply pressure. It's not just competition for those properties. Those properties are defining the niche, so the competition begins to reshape the niche. So it's like Voronoi or bubbles pushed together. They deform as the population changes, depending upon the physical attributes, the consumption rates. They're not just a fixed notion. It's a hard thing to define a niche. So they dynamically interact, these niches. And any given niche, a social bubble that people construct, would change depending upon how many people are in it, who else is around, if they're related in some way, who enters the bubble, and so on. And then removing these physical attributes would also change. Now, I'm just saying these things, but this is pointing to a very different conception of what an interface is and what the nature of interaction is that the future of HCI must design toward. Because with the AI embedded stuff that we're going to have, it's going to be more inside the world, and it's going to be participating. So suppose you're having little robots in whatever form factor you can think of, including your chairs. What are they going to have to do to participate in this world? So here's how I like to think of it. That's all we have time for. Now, consider this typical social interaction. For me, this is a canonical example of joint activity. Some of you remember it, and some of you will do it, and some of you are doing it. Trying to dress a kid. And what exactly is the interface? Well, this interface is different if you do it in the big room than if you do it in the confines of a closet. So there are different interfaces, and there's different socio-ecological niches because the physical spaces are affecting the social interactions. They're affecting the physical interactions, and through the constraint on physical interaction, the kid gets more cranky, he hits his elbow, whatever goes on. So what's special about social niche interaction? And the way I like to think of it is, what will it take to get robots to participate appropriately? And by robot, I just mean an AI in stuff. So it involves other people, not just physical or digital things. There's always a back and forth, and that back and forth is more cognitively demanding than just physical control. There are special neural systems in the human body for this. Humans have special neural systems. And you have to understand social intent. But it turns out that more neural equipment is recruited than just understanding neural intent, social intent looking at a video. So you can do a good job of understanding social intent in a video, but consider having a sort of skin in the game. When you're actually engaged in the social interaction, there is a much more, a greater state of arousal. I don't mean just sexual arousal. There's other kinds, social arousal. Let's just call it that. And so there's something else going on. It's the game that means that there's different neural processes activated. So now, the robot? What's the robot got to do in order to have this level of participation? So we have things like shared delight. Is the robot going to participate in shared delight? Will you think the robot is participating in shared? Because if you don't think the robot is participating in shared delight, it doesn't satisfy the conditions. Because it takes two to share delight. So there's this sense of social co-presence. Whatever that is, that's what the robot is missing to some degree. You don't get social co-presence without a body, with a front and a back. And then the people in that space have this situation awareness of knowledge of what's around it, and they share it, and they know the other has situation awareness, and they have a good idea of what their situation awareness is and my situation. So there's this recursive function thing going on. We have a sense of agency, the capacity for joint activity, joint agency. There are emotions, and we're always affected by the others, whether we know it or not. So among the things are, I'm aware of what I can reach, what you can reach. So there's the peripersonal space, and then the notion of shared peripersonal space, which is a hardwired sort of thing. And I know these things about you, and you know these things about me. So we have this recursive common ground going on that builds up through this social structural coupling. And this makes possible a distributed cognition. It applies to emotion, and I just want to get to conclusions now. So the next phase of HCI will involve, I believe, a niche notion of interaction. It's got to be much more 3D enveloping in the world, and this because unlike classical interactivity and the burgeoning network interactivity, there's no interface that we're on one side of and it's on the other side. We're in it together. That changes everything. The buildings and the stuff, they're an intrinsic part of the ecological and social ecology, but we have to see ourselves as integral to that too. And that requires thinking differently about interfaces and interactivity. In this world where we are all together, we're going to share things like situation awareness that goes recursively. We know when people are near us. When another dog enters the same space as one dog, the brain alarms go off. When two conspecifics are in the same room, they know it very quickly and the brains show it. So you can be certain that there are very significant differences. I don't know what it's like when a robot enters the room. I expect there's a lot of things that go off when the robot enters the room, but one of them might be danger. Another thing. So we can also participate in joint activity. We feel or understand emotions in this COCO way, and we tacitly negotiate. The bottom line is that AIs will have to infer meaning and not just third-person meaning, the meaning of having skin in the game meaning, and they'll have to understand the point of activity in a deeper way than they do, and what it means to be social cognizer. And that's different sort of interaction than HCI or AI historically has considered. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for comments and questions.
Hello.
So, David, this business of tango, I'm interacting pretty deeply with my model of tango. And that woman, when he raises her leg, she's not interacting with her partner. She's interacting. It's almost like she's scratching herself, but also she has a model of the audience, very deep model of the audience.
Sure.
And I think those things are even stronger issues than the interaction between. I mean, it might be much more heavily on their mind than anything about the random person they're happen to be playing tango with, or the robot that they're playing tango with.
Okay, so to have the competence to perform tango, you're suggesting, no doubt, there's got to be some truth in it. You have various sorts of cognitive models or cognitive somethings, rules. I don't know what you have, but there are norms that you're trying to satisfy and senses of creative possibility that are driving your movements.
Much more than anything else.
Now that interaction, which occurs as much inside the head or between you and your body, that's interesting. If it's inside your head, for me, that's another kind of interaction. I'm not looking at that as HCI. Why? Because for the same reason that when I look at the painting on the wall or I read the document without touching it, I'm not interacting with the document. I'm cognitively acting on the document. It's very active, no question about it. I can be engaged in active perception. I can do all of these things. But one thing I'm not doing, I'm not changing its state. So that's a hard thing, changing its state. I mean, hard in the sense of it's factual. So I want to cleave the difference between, when you make a state change on the outside and when you don't. Now, when people go inside the head and they start to say, System A is interacting with System B. Okay, so System B, let us say, is the model they have of the tango possibilities. System A is their predictive system or their normative system or what I have to do. There's plenty of interaction going on. That's for the cognitive neuroscientists or the cognitive scientists or the whoever you want, psychologists. That's their job. But when we're trying to understand interactivity for the world of HCI, which is going outside the person, whatever else might be going on inside the person, then I want this distinction because I think this distinction is like a forcing function that gives us some clarity on some things. It only answers some questions.
She lifts her leg.
Yeah,
She's not doing that for her partner. She's either doing it for herself or for the audience.
But the success conditions, well, the success conditions are external. So she may be doing it for herself, but we tell her she did it badly, no matter what she might think, on the basis of the norms outside. So there are outward norms that are the bottom line in a Wittgensteinian way that, you just keep doing it wrong. It doesn't matter what you think, you're doing it wrong. I mean, we are naturally going to have much more conversation about that.
And first, thank you for your inquiries in this space and symmetry and transitivity and reflexivity. And your epistemologist is definitely showing, but also your axiologist is showing. So you talk a lot about the epistemic, and you pepper the deontic shoulds, And I want to hear more about the axiology, because you've got a theory of what it is that people should be able to do in interactive systems. And where is that coming from? I understand where your logic comes from, but where's your value system coming from?
Where does the value system come from? Well, I mean, the values I stated about way back about.
Control, transparency.
No, they were. I think they were back here. Maybe I'm going to get to the wrong place. Sorry, this would not be the way to do it. Okay, I'm not going to find it. Those were things like, well, facilitating the people's values. So in the case of, if you're asking, as an architect, what are you trying to do? I might wish to engender a sense of beauty. I might wish to engender a sense of freedom. I might wish to qualitatively improve their experience. Now, then you're obliged to give an account of what experience design is or experiences that you're doing. Not offering an account of any of those, but that clearly is an architectural desire, as well as, of course, designing the space for its acoustics, for its visual capacities, and its comfort. There are other things that one could do. And so a good architect, it seems to me, would try to canvas what some of the positive elements of the best theaters are of this sort, and they would try to enhance those.
I was thinking part of the conflicts between values and the trade-offs that are inevitable. So enabling activity and enabling autonomy may be different.
Sure. So a production line.
You've got freedom from and freedom to.
Yes.
Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty, right?
Yes. So a production line is a good example of that. If you have a production line, you can really streamline the efficiency, but the cost is that the degree of freedom that any individual has is much constrained. So yeah, but those are post questions. They are all sort of instances of questions that take place in the broader framework. There was a, yeah, okay.
One more maybe?
Okay,
Yeah.
then you choose.
Like as when you talk about think about architecture in space, the human brain has humongous or beautiful capabilities organizing and navigating to space. When you go from A to B, New York and London, I can ask you, you'll find it. But when you create interactions in thought space, I mean, what are your thoughts about using these capabilities of the brain of navigation and mapping and all these other things for creating interfaces when in a few years screens will disappear, 2D will disappear, and we will interact with images in space and thoughts in space and spatial reasoning?
Yeah, so I'm going to characterize your question to be about the design of cognitive scaffolds in the outside world. So there is an open field. When people are interested in visualization, they're interested in being able to get insight into some process or some question they have by looking at the stuff and interacting with the digital things that constitute the visualization. Well, there's a lot of other possibilities for creating cognitive insight that come by scaffolding appropriately. So you can, a lined paper can enable you to do certain things that an unlined paper gives you different opportunities. So there's a whole universe of questions about that. And now you say, well, what about adaptive ones, where we can change it in tune with the person? It's a wonderful inquiry, absolutely wonderful. But it is in the spirit of this, I'm not sure if it's socio, but it's certainly in the spirit of interaction with the person. But in this case, it's a challenge for me a little bit if the person doesn't do anything on it, but they just cognitively project. So think of projection as like augmented reality, but in your mind. So we have maybe 10,000 articles on visual imagery, but of those 10,000 articles, almost none, if any, distinguish eyes open from eyes closed visual imagery. Now, eyes open visual imagery, imagine you see a tic-tac-toe board on the screen, and I ask you about a couple of moves. Imagine you don't, you have your eyes closed. I ask you the same question. I've managed to give you a way of, asking that question without begging the question, giving you the structure. Now, one should be harder than the other because I have a visual scaffold to use, even though it's static. It's just the empty scaffold. So we don't understand much yet the nature of how to modify those scaffolds, and possibly in a dynamic way, to facilitate guiding thought or making thought easier. And that, it seems to me, is a wonderful area. I'm personally very interested in that, but a wonderful area. And I think, it is in the spirit of your question. One of the many things that comes up from a question like that is how to design the world to facilitate X, Y, Z. In this case, X is some kind of knowledge, epistemic, some kind of inquiry, values, experience. How do we design the world to do that? That is the question of, I think, the future HCI and design. So it's the basic question. I think I'm supposed to say thank you now.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.